Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel follow a recognizable shape. Man meets woman online or in a bar. Money starts moving. Things go wrong. There's a confrontation, a flight home, a hard lesson delivered to camera. You know the genre by now. Today's story is different. Not because it doesn't involve money moving in the wrong direction. It does, quite a lot of it. And not because there isn't a woman at the center of it. There is, and she matters. But the man telling this story didn't get scammed in the way you might be expecting. What happened to Brendan is quieter than that, and in some ways more instructive, because it's happening to thousands of retirees right now who will never make a video about it. Brendan is 63 years old. He's from Cork, in the south of Ireland. He spent 35 years as a bookkeeper, the kind of man who could find a €2 discrepancy in a ledger from 2009 without breaking a sweat. He is precise, careful, dry-humored, and not remotely the type you'd expect to end up confused about where his money went. And yet, here's his story, in his own words. The clock is on my mantelpiece now. Waterford crystal. Nice piece, probably worth a few quid. I didn't put it out before I left for the Philippines. I'm not sure why. Maybe it felt like a consolation prize, and I didn't want to look at it. Anyway, it's out now. They gave it to me on my last day at Callahan Logistics. February, 2 years before all this. 43 signatures on the card. I counted, because of course I counted. And a speech from Dermot in accounts payable that went on about 6 minutes longer than it needed to. Good man, Dermot. Means well. The speech was fine. 35 years, chief bookkeeper. I started there when the place was run out of a converted warehouse off the South Ring Road, and I finished there when they had a proper office park, and 84 employees and a server room I didn't fully understand, but had strong opinions about anyway. Every VAT return filed, every payroll processed, every audit we ever had we came through clean. That was me. Not glamorous work. Nobody writes songs about bookkeepers, but it was solid. The columns either balanced or they didn't, and mine balanced. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, not to boast, but because it matters to the story. I was genuinely good at that job, and then it was over. The first Monday morning after I retired, I got up at the usual time, 7:15, made the tea, got dressed, not in work clothes, but dressed because I'm not an animal, sat down, and then I had nothing to do, which sounds like a small thing, a nice thing even. But I'll tell you, it was the strangest feeling I've ever had. Like reaching for a door handle that isn't there. I thought it would pass. I'd read that it takes a few weeks to adjust. Retirement shock, they call it. I'd nodded along when I read about it, the way you nod along at something you're quite sure won't apply to you. It didn't pass. I tried golf, got the clubs out of the garage. I'd owned them for 12 years and used them maybe 4 times. Went to the Douglas course a few Tuesday mornings. It was fine. The golf was fine. The views were fine. I just couldn't work out what I was doing there. It felt like waiting for something that wasn't coming. I drove down to Limerick a few weekends to see my daughter, Aoife, and her lot. 2 grandchildren, Saoirse and the small fella whose name I will not attempt to spell. They're lovely children. I mean that. But they're Aoife's children, not mine. And you can feel that distinction clearly when you're sitting in someone else's kitchen, trying to be a useful presence, while a 4-year-old explains an episode of something you've never watched. I drove home each time feeling roughly the same as when I'd arrived. I walked the Lee, read some books, watched more television than I'd watched in the previous decade combined. At a certain point, I reorganized my filing system at home, which is not a normal thing for a retired person to do for entertainment, and I knew something was going wrong. The thing is, I wasn't unhappy in the way people mean when they say unhappy. I wasn't low. I wasn't tearful. I didn't need a doctor. I was just structureless. That's the word I keep coming back to. For 35 years, I had known exactly what I was for. And now I didn't. And all the retirement advice in the world about taking up hobbies and traveling more and spending time with family, it all assumes you have some underlying sense of yourself that the job was merely supplementing. Turns out, the job was doing more load-bearing work than I'd realized. I started having trouble sleeping around the 6-month mark. Not dramatic insomnia, just waking at 2 or 3 in the morning and lying there with my brain running through nothing in particular at low speed. I'd pick up my phone, scroll through things, watch a bit of something. That's how I found the Philippines. I say found, as if it were an accident. It wasn't entirely accidental. I'd been watching bits and pieces about retirement abroad, Spain, Portugal, whatever the algorithm served up. But the Philippines ones were different. The ones I kept watching weren't the glossy travel show types. They were made by ordinary men, mostly my age, mostly from Britain or Australia or the States, sitting in front of their laptops or out on some terrace with a ceiling fan turning overhead. One lad, English fellow, used to do his videos at a table with a spreadsheet visible behind him on his monitor. I found that reassuring. It felt like my kind of content. They talked about the numbers plainly. What rent cost, what food cost, what their pension was, and how far it stretched. A retired British civil servant somewhere called Dumaguete was explaining, in a flat Midlands accent, that his £1,100 a month made him comfortable there in a way it could never manage in Birmingham. He wasn't selling anything. He was just showing his workings. I got out my own spreadsheet. My pension was coming in at about €1,240 a month. Not enormous, but mine. Reliable. Guaranteed. I had $92,000 in savings, accumulated over decades of being the sort of person who doesn't spend money frivolously. I modeled the numbers against the costs these lads were describing. Rent in Cebu City, they were saying, €300 to €400 for a decent apartment. Food, utilities, transport, another $200, maybe $250. Healthcare was cheaper than Ireland, significantly. The arithmetic came out well, comfortably well. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I didn't do what some men do, which is fall in love with the idea and then make the numbers fit. I did the numbers first. The numbers were genuinely good. That's not me making excuses. It's relevant to understanding what happened later, which is that the numbers I modeled were correct as far as they went. It was what they didn't include that undid me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I booked a 2-week trip to Cebu City. February. Described it to Awif as a recce. I used that word specifically, recce, because it implied practicality rather than escapism, and I didn't want a conversation about it. She looked slightly worried, but said to send her photos. I said I would. I packed light, brought my laptop, flew via Dubai, which is a long way from Cork, and landed at Mactan Cebu International at 6 in the morning into air that was already warm and smelled of nothing quite like home. I had no idea, standing in that arrivals hall with my one bag and my spreadsheet full of sensible projections, what the next 2.5 years were going to cost me. Not just in money, though it cost me money, in something harder to quantify. But then, quantifying things was supposed to be my area. The insomnia started properly around October, 6 months into retirement, give or take. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't lying there in a cold sweat. Nothing like that. I'd just wake at 1:30 or 3 in the morning with my brain ticking over in neutral. And sleep would be gone, And that would be that for the night. I'd pick up my phone, read the news, which was a mistake, scroll through things, which was also a mistake but a less depressing one, and at some point, the algorithm, or whatever you want to call it, started serving me videos about retiring abroad. I watched a few out of mild curiosity, and then I watched about 40 more over the following 3 weeks because apparently that's who I was now. Spain came up a lot, Portugal, a few about Mexico, and then the Philippines ones started appearing and they were different. The tone was different. The Spain videos were all about wine regions and property prices and lovely cobbled streets. Fine, grand, not for me. The Philippines videos were made by men who looked like they'd worked for a living, sitting in plastic chairs on tiled verandas with a ceiling fan moving the warm air around, wearing the kind of short-sleeved shirts you'd buy in Dunn's, not performing anything. One lad I kept coming back to, English, somewhere in the Midlands by the accent, did his videos at a desk with a spreadsheet open on the monitor behind him. He'd actually turn around mid-sentence and point at figures. His name was something like Gary or Gaz, I can't fully remember. He lived in a place called Dumaguete, which I'd never heard of, on an island called Negros Oriental. He was getting by comfortably on his civil service pension, £1,100 a month, he said, in a way he described, without any self-pity, as simply impossible back in Birmingham. He showed the workings. That's what got me. He wasn't selling a fantasy. He was doing arithmetic. I got up at 3:30 one Tuesday morning, made tea, opened my laptop, and started a new spreadsheet, which is, now that I say it aloud, the most Brendan thing that has ever happened. My pension, €1,240 a month, reliable as the tide. My savings, €92,000, accumulated over decades of being constitutionally unable to spend money I didn't need to spend. I started entering figures from the videos. Rent for a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Cebu City. The videos said anywhere from 15 to 25,000 pesos a month. I looked up the exchange rate. At the time, that was roughly 250 to 400 euros, less than a third of what a comparable place would cost in Cork. Groceries, modest, utilities, low, transport, negligible if you used Grab and the occasional jeepney, healthcare, cheaper than Ireland significantly, though I noted that as a variable requiring further research. I built out a 12-month model, then a 5-year model. The pension, at those costs, covered everything with room left over. The savings need barely be touched for routine living. And the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, required a deposit of $20,000, which you kept in a Philippine bank, but which remained your money. Not a fee, a deposit. I noted that distinction carefully. By 5 in the morning, I had a document that was either a sensible retirement plan or evidence that I had completely lost the plot. I genuinely wasn't certain which. I didn't tell anyone I was thinking about it. Not Awife, not my friend Seamus from work, who rang every few weeks to tell me about things that were happening at Callahan's. I read forums. I found an expat group on Facebook, mostly British and Australian lads, a few Americans, and spent 2 weeks reading through posts going back years. The complaints were consistent. Visa runs every 2 months on a tourist visa until you sorted the SRRV. Family obligation requests that could spiral, health care gaps if you got seriously ill. These were noted, added to a separate tab. There was one thread I kept thinking about. A man, Australian, had written a fairly long post about what he called the retirement content gap. The videos show you the monthly costs, he said. They don't show you what it costs to be the only wealthy person in every room you enter. I bookmarked that post. Didn't fully understand it yet. Filed it away. I booked the trip in January. 2 weeks in Cebu City, departing February the 8th, returning February the 22nd. Framed it to myself as a recce. Due diligence. The kind of preliminary site visit you'd do before committing to anything significant. I had done 35 years of due diligence professionally. I could surely manage it for my own retirement. Awefi took it better than I expected. She looked at me for a moment over her kitchen table. That particular look she has, the one that contains about 6 things she's decided not to say, and then asked if I'd be warm enough, which from Iwif is practically a standing ovation. I flew out via Dubai on the 8th of February. 14 hours in the air total, plus the layover. I am not a comfortable flyer, not frightened, just not comfortable. And I remember standing in the Dubai terminal at 2 in the morning local time, drinking a coffee that cost approximately the GDP of a small nation, and thinking, well, here we are, Brendan. Here we actually are. Mactan Cebu International Airport, 6:40 in the morning. I walked out of arrivals, and the heat came at me immediately. Even at that hour, a warm, damp weight of air that had absolutely no interest in the temperature I'd grown up considering normal. The smell was, I'd struggle to describe it exactly. Diesel fumes, something floral underneath, food being cooked somewhere nearby even at that hour, a row of drivers holding signs, the noise of jeepneys and tricycles moving in a logic that wasn't immediately obvious to me. I'd booked a guest house near Lahug, recommended on the forum. Ate Nora's place, it was called informally. Her actual name was Leonora, but everyone called her Ate Nora, which I would later understand meant something like elder sister, and was a form of respectful address rather than a literal family claim. She was 60-something, brisk, had opinions about everything, and ran a clean and well-organized operation. I checked in, slept for 3 hours, and woke at noon to the sound of a rooster that had either not received the memo about daylight hours or simply didn't care. Outside my window, a narrow street, a sari store with hand-painted lettering, 3 children playing basketball on a concrete court with a bent hoop and no net, doing it with complete seriousness. A jeepney went past painted in gold and red with a saint's face on the bonnet, and bass-heavy music coming from inside. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, and then Ate Nora knocked on my door and asked, in the particular tone of someone who considers feeding people an act of basic decency, whether I'd eaten anything since I'd landed. I said I hadn't. She said she'd make me something, and to come down when I was ready. I went down. She made sinangag, garlic fried rice, and eggs, and something she called longanisa, which is a sweet-cured sausage, and which I would normally have had strong reservations about at noon after a long flight, but which I ate entirely and without hesitation. She asked what I was there for. I explained. The recce, the retirement research, the spreadsheet I'd built. She listened carefully. And then she said something I wrote in my notebook that evening, because I was the sort of man who kept a notebook on this trip. She said, "The numbers are usually right. It's the other things people don't put in the spreadsheet." I wrote it down, nodded politely. Thought I understood what she meant. I did not yet understand what she meant. Ate Nora introduced us on a Sunday. She'd invited a few people for lunch. The way she did most Sundays, I came to understand, a rolling gathering of neighbors and friends, and the occasional guest house guest she'd decided was worth keeping. There was a retired schoolteacher from Mandu, a young couple who lived 2 doors down, someone's cousin visiting from Davao. The food was on the table before I'd worked out who anyone was. Pork adobo, a big pot of sinigang that smelled of tamarind and fish, rice, some kind of vegetable dish I couldn't identify but ate anyway. Maravich arrived about 20 minutes after I did, apologized for being late in the way Filipinos do, which is to say, she didn't really apologize but smiled in a way that covered the same ground, and sat across from me at the table. I want to be honest about what I noticed first, because it matters to understanding why I wasn't more cautious. She wasn't the most striking person in the room. She was 44, I'd later learn, a little younger looking than that, dressed neatly in the way of someone who takes that seriously without making a production of it. She had reading glasses pushed up into her hair that she'd forget were there and search for twice during lunch. What I noticed was that she was talking to the school teacher about something. Regional transport policy, of all things. Some road project between Cebu and Toledo. And she was talking about it with actual opinions. Not performing having opinions. Having them. Aunt Nora told me, later, that she'd thought of introducing us because Maravich was sensible and spoke good English, and wouldn't bother me with nonsense. She said this as a compliment. It was, I think, accurate. Maravich worked at a travel agency in the IT Park, the modern business district in Lahug, all glass buildings and coffee shops, and young professionals eating lunch on curbs with their laptops. She'd been there 11 years. Before that, she'd studied tourism management at the University of San Carlos. Her husband had died of a heart attack 6 years before. He was 41. No warning. A Tuesday morning. She had a daughter, Precious, who was 17, and living with Maravich's mother in Tagbilaran in Bohol while she finished secondary school. She told me this information across about 4 separate conversations over the remainder of my 2-week recce. Not as a presentation. Just as things came up. I want to be clear about that because it's relevant to why I trusted it. She didn't volunteer her whole life history over lunch. I had to ask, over time, and the answers were consistent and unremarkable and connected to previous answers in the way that true things do. She took me to the Basilica Minore del Santo Niño on the Wednesday. I'd wanted to see it. I'd read about it. One of the oldest churches in the Philippines. This small, dark statue of the infant Christ that Magellan supposedly gave to a local chieftain in 1521, and that survived everything that followed. We stood in the cool interior while the candles flickered, and she explained things quietly, not performing piety, just contextualizing. She prayed for a few minutes. I stood nearby and didn't pray, being uncertain of the protocol, and she didn't comment on it either way. She corrected my pronunciation of Cebuano words, which I was attempting badly. She found this genuinely funny, not unkindly, but the kind of laugh that means she was actually entertained rather than politely tolerating me. She asked questions about Cork that were specific rather than vague, which I noticed. Not just what is Ireland like, but things like whether the River Lee actually flooded much, whether the hurling was really that serious, whether it was true that Cork people thought Cork was better than Dublin. I confirmed the last one with some feeling. On the second Friday, she asked if I wanted to see Bohol. She was going that weekend to visit her daughter and her mother, and would I like to come along? She could show me the Chocolate Hills and the Tarsiers and Alona Beach, just as something to see while I was there on my recce. I said yes. I want to be transparent about why. Partly because I wanted to see Bohol, which by all accounts was worth seeing, and partly because I wanted to see who she was when she was at home. That sounds calculated, but it wasn't quite. It was more instinctive than that. I just wanted to know if she was the same person there as she was in Cebu. She was. That's the thing. She was entirely the same person. We took the fast ferry from Pier 1, 2 hours across the Cebu Strait, on a vessel that was genuinely fast and genuinely uncomfortable in the way of things optimized for speed rather than pleasure. She read a magazine. I looked at the water. Her mother, Lola Coring, was 71 and diabetic, and had the particular quality of elderly women who have outlasted most of what life threw at them and are mildly amused by the remainder. She spoke limited English, but communicated effectively through a combination of Cebuano, gestures, and expressions. She fed me a great deal. Refusal was not, I gathered, available as an option. Precious was 17, and studying hard and shy in the specific way of teenagers who are actually quite confident but won't show it to a stranger. She looked at me with frank assessment for about 30 seconds when we arrived, and then apparently decided I was acceptable, because she relaxed after that, and argued with her mother about something in Cebuano for a few minutes in a way that sounded entirely normal. The chocolate hills were extraordinary. Rows of perfectly rounded brown hills in the dry season heat, over 1,000 of them, spread across the interior of the island. Geological formations that look like something a child would design. I took photographs. Maravich had seen them many times and still looked at them the same way I did. Alona Beach in the evening. She had a San Miguel. I had one too because it seemed rude not to. The water was the color of, well, you know the color. You either know it or you don't. I flew back to Cork 5 days later. On the plane, somewhere over the Gulf, I thought about what I was doing. The spreadsheet still made sense. Cebu was livable, more than livable. The SRRV was feasible. The practical case held. And Maravich. I thought about Maravich. She was not a bar girl. I want to say that plainly. And I'm aware that saying it plainly is itself a thing worth examining. The fact that it mattered so much to me, this distinction. But it did matter. It still matters to how I understand what happened. She was a widow with a job and a daughter, and opinions about regional transport policy, and a mother who force-fed me rice. She was a real person with a real life. We'd exchanged numbers. She sent me a WhatsApp message when she knew I'd landed. Safe travels Po. The Po at the end, the little Cebuano respect marker. It made me smile. I'm not sure I'd smiled without effort for months before that. I returned to Cork and I updated the spreadsheet. Added a new column. It didn't have a header yet. I wasn't sure what to call it. I booked a second trip for 6 weeks later. The decision to relocate properly happened on a Tuesday evening in Cork, in October, 8 months after the first trip. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside it. And I was on a video call with Maravich, and she was showing me, for some reason I can't now reconstruct, the view from her apartment window in La Hug at dusk, just turning the phone around to show me the sky going orange over the rooftops. And I thought, I could be there. Not in a romantic, impulsive way. More like a logical conclusion I'd been circling for months and had finally arrived at. I'd been back twice since the first recce. 4 days in June, 10 days in August. Each time I'd updated the spreadsheet. Each time the numbers held. And each time I came home to Cork, the house felt emptier in a way that had nothing to do with its actual size. I told Maravich I was thinking of coming properly, for a year initially, to see how it went. She was quiet for a moment, the way she was sometimes quiet before saying something she'd considered. Then she said that was good, that she'd be glad. She said it in the straightforward way she had of saying things that mattered, without decoration. I gave myself 2 months to sort things. Rented out my house in Bishopstown. A letting agent handled it, straightforward enough, which gave me an additional $850 a month on top of the pension. I had $92,000 in savings minus what I'd spent across the 3 visits. Airfares, accommodation, the weekend in Bohol, gifts, meals. About €1,400 total across the 4 months, which I thought of as roughly what a European holiday would have cost me anyway. I wasn't alarmed. I arrived in Cebu on the 14th of December, took a grab from the airport to an apartment I'd arranged in advance. A two-bedroom in a building off Escario Street in Cebu City, 22,000 pesos a month, which was about 350 euros. Clean. A ceiling fan and an aircon unit. A small balcony facing another building. Not picturesque, but functional, which is what I wanted. I was on a tourist visa initially. 30 days, renewable. The SRRV application was in progress. I'd engaged a consultant I'd found through the expat Facebook group. A man called Aldrin, seemed professional, had a proper website with his accreditation details on it. The process takes several months. I had time. The first few weeks were straightforwardly pleasant. I settled into a routine. Coffee in the morning at a place near the Gaisano Grand Mall on Colon Street. Walk, back to the apartment, some reading. Meet Marivich in the evenings when she finished work. We'd eat at a carinderia near her office that did good bulalo, or sometimes she'd cook at her place. She was a better cook than the carinderia, though I didn't say that to the carinderia. The first family request arrived in the 7th month. I want to describe how it came, because the manner of it is the whole point. Marivich didn't ask me directly. That's not quite how it works. What happened was that she mentioned over dinner one evening. We were at a Turo place near the Carbon Market. That whole area smells of fish and diesel and warm concrete. She mentioned that her brother Carlo was having a problem with his nursing degree fees. 2nd year. The scholarship covered tuition, but there was a gap for laboratory fees and clinical placement costs that the scholarship didn't cover. She mentioned this as information, not a request. She was looking at her food when she said it. I asked how much. She said she was going to try to manage it herself. She'd been putting some money aside. I asked again how much. She said 140,000 pesos, which is about 2,200 euros. She said it quietly. I thought about it. 140,000 pesos for a nursing degree semester. A qualified nurse can work anywhere in the world. The Philippines exports nurses in enormous numbers. I knew this. Carlo finishing his degree had real economic value for the whole family, not just as education, but as future earning capacity. The request made structural sense, and Marivich was not asking. She was informing me of a situation. I said I'd cover it. She looked up from her food and started to say something about paying me back, and I said not to bother. And she looked at me in a way I found difficult to read, somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated. And she said, "Thank you, Paul." I went home that night and opened the spreadsheet. Added a new line. Stage 2, I wrote. First family transfer. $140,000, $2,240. I told myself it was a one-off. I was wrong, but I told myself that. Over the following 14 months, the requests came in at a pace that was, individually, always manageable. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only way to convey what actually happened. Lola Coring's diabetes medication and 2 clinic consultations at Chonghua Hospital, P38,000, about $610. The roof of the family house in Tagbilaran needed repair after Typhoon Odette had lifted part of it. Marivich's brother-in-law had a contact who'd do it for P95,000, roughly $1,520. Sister Lynn had complications during a second pregnancy, and the government hospital in Tagbilaran had a waiting time that the attending doctor said was not safe. The private maternity ward cost P112,000, which was $1,790. School supplies and uniforms for 3 of the nieces and nephews at the start of the school year, $22,000, about $350. A cousin had a legal problem involving a motorbike accident and a dispute about liability, and needed bail money while it was sorted. P45,000, roughly $720. Every single one of these was real. I want to say that clearly. I checked what I could check. The hospital bills existed. The roof existed. The cousin's legal situation was exactly what Maravich said it was. Messy, unfortunate, the kind of thing that happens to people who don't have money to insulate themselves from the consequences of bad luck. I'm not saying I was deceived about the facts of any individual request. What I'm saying is that I failed to model the system. Each request was a tree. I never looked at the forest. There's a word in Filipino, utang na loob, debt of gratitude. The idea that if someone does something for you, there is a profound, non-negotiable obligation to repay it, and that this obligation flows through families, not just individuals. Maravich's family knew she had a partner who helped. That knowledge created its own logic. Not malice, not conspiracy. Just the entirely rational behavior of people who knew that help was available and that need was real. Maravich was the eldest. She'd been carrying her family's financial weight since before I arrived. I didn't add to that burden. I reduced it, substantially. And in doing so, I became part of the structure, without ever agreeing to be, to the running total across those 14 months, $452,000. 22 individual transactions, about $7,200. I knew the number because I had a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was my one consistent act of self-preservation throughout all of this, though it would take me longer to actually read what it was telling me. The night I paid for Lynn's maternity bill, I sat on my balcony in Escario Street and listened to a neighbor 2 buildings over doing karaoke. Something slow and emotional, a Filipino ballad I half recognized, and I thought about whether I was making a mistake. Not the individual payment, the whole arrangement, the position I was in. I didn't come to a conclusion. I went back inside. I updated the spreadsheet. I closed the laptop. The next morning, Maravich sent me a photo of Lynn holding the baby. A boy. Healthy. Both of them fine. I thought, well, it's hard to argue with that. Aldrin called himself a retirement visa specialist. His website, I'm looking at it right now, in my memory, the way you replay things, had the Philippine Retirement Authority logo on it, a list of services, client testimonials, a mobile number, and an email address that ended in Gmail, which I noted and then decided wasn't necessarily suspicious, because lots of legitimate small businesses use Gmail. He had a Facebook page with 112 followers. He responded to my initial inquiry within 4 hours. He was professional, articulate, answered my questions specifically rather than generally, and quoted me a realistic timeline for the SRRV application of 4 to 5 months. I want to say that because I've seen people in expat forums described as idiots for falling for obvious scams, and I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's accurate to what actually happened to me. Aldrin was not obvious. He was careful and convincing, and he let the first 2 months of the process proceed exactly as a legitimate application would, with regular updates and what appeared to be genuine paperwork. But I'm getting ahead of myself slightly. By month 18 of living in Cebu, things had settled into a shape I'd have described, if asked, as working. The apartment on Escario Street, the morning coffee routine, the walking, Maravich 3 or 4 evenings a week, sometimes the whole weekend. The family requests arriving at their own irregular pace, each one handled, each one added to the spreadsheet, the total growing in a way I was tracking, but not yet fully computing in forward projection terms. The relationship with Maravich had deepened in the quiet way that relationships deepen when nobody's performing anything. We had not defined it formally. I was aware of that absence of definition. She was, I think, also aware of it. But we were comfortable. That's the honest word. She knew how I took my coffee. I knew she got cold in air-conditioned malls and always needed a cardigan, even in 30-degree heat. I knew her opinions about her colleagues, and she knew mine about the expat Facebook group, which were not entirely charitable. I hadn't met many other expats socially. A few, in passing. There was a British lad, retired RAF, who drank at a place near the Ayala Center Cebu most afternoons and held court about how the Philippines had changed since he'd arrived 15 years ago, always for the worse, always delivered with the satisfaction of someone who preferred the complaint to the remedy. I had a coffee with him twice. That was enough. Then Aldrin raised the complication. He called me, on my mobile, which in retrospect I should have found odd. Everything to that point had been WhatsApp, on a Thursday afternoon in March, month 19. He explained carefully that my pension documentation, being Irish rather than UK or US, had created an issue with the PRA's verification process. The format didn't meet their current requirements, apparently revised in a recent circular. This was fixable, he said. It would require resubmission with certified translation and apostille, plus what he called a liaison fee to expedite the reprocessing. Standard practice, he said, when applications had to be restarted partway through. He quoted me 310,000 pesos, about 5,000 euros. I sat with that figure for 3 days. I ran searches. I found forum posts about PRA documentation complications, about application restarts, about liaison fees. The posts were vague and various and contradictory in the way that forum posts about bureaucratic processes always are. I couldn't find anything that specifically confirmed or denied what Aldrin was describing. I emailed him asking for the specific PRA circular reference. He sent me a document. It looked official. It had a letterhead and a reference number. I know, sitting here now, that I should have called the PRA directly at that point. The PRA has a publicly listed number and email address. I had both of them. The correct action was to contact them independently and ask whether the circular Aldrin had referenced was real. I didn't do that. I told myself I would, and then I didn't. And I can't fully explain why, except that the alternative, that Aldrin was lying, that the entire SRRV process I'd been managing for months was fraudulent, that I would have to start again from nothing, was a conclusion I wasn't ready to reach. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. I transferred 310,000 pesos to the account Aldrin provided, just over 5,000 euros, drawn from savings. He confirmed receipt, said the reprocessing would take 6 to 8 weeks. And then I did something that, professionally, I'd always considered basic practice. I updated the spreadsheet, added Aldrin's fee as stage 4, wrote a note beside it. SRRV processing. Await confirmation. I waited 6 weeks. No update from Aldrin except one brief WhatsApp message at week 3 saying it was progressing. At week 7, I messaged him and got no reply. At week 8, I called the mobile number. It rang out. I tried 3 more times over the following week. Nothing. The Facebook page was still there. The website was still there. But Aldrin had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a responsive human being. It was around this time that Maravich noticed something was wrong. Not through any conversation about Aldrin. I hadn't told her the details of the SRRV process, partly because it was genuinely complicated, and partly because I didn't want to worry her. What she noticed was that I was quieter than usual. She said this one evening when we were sitting on her small balcony in Lahug, with a red horse each, the city making its night noises below. A jeepney somewhere. Music from a sari-sari store. The faint repetitive bass of someone's karaoke 2 streets over. She asked what was wrong. I said I was sorting something out and would tell her when there was something definite to tell. She didn't push. She knew not to push, which was one of the things about her I'd come to rely on in a way I hadn't quite realized until that moment. I went home and opened the spreadsheet. Not to add anything, just to look at it. I did something I hadn't done before. I opened a new sheet and built a forward projection. Not of expenses month by month, which I'd been tracking, but of savings depletion. At the current rate of family contributions, plus living costs above what the pension covered, plus what I'd just lost to Aldrin, how long did I have? I ran the numbers 3 times because the first answer seemed wrong. It wasn't wrong. Savings remaining after Aldrin, approximately 54,000 euros. 4 years, maybe 4.5, if I stopped the family contributions entirely, which was its own complication. I was 63 years old. I could easily live to 90. That was 27 years. The pension would continue. The pension covered the basics. But I had no SRRV, which meant no long-term visa security, no right to work, no local health care entitlements, no property, no legal standing, and 54,000 euros that, if the current pattern continued, would be gone before I turned 68. I closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it again. There's a thing that happens when you've spent your whole career reading financial documents. You develop a physical response to numbers that don't work. A sort of stillness. Not panic. Just clarity. The same clarity I'd felt 35 years ago when I first opened a set of accounts that had been badly mismanaged by someone who'd retired without proper handover. And I looked at the columns and understood immediately, calmly and without drama, that this was going to take a very long time to fix. That was the feeling. That old professional stillness. This was going to require a decision. I called the Philippine Retirement Authority on a Wednesday morning. Found the number on their official government website, .gov.ph, which I checked carefully, because by this point I was checking everything carefully, which was approximately 2 years too late. But there we are. The woman who answered was helpful and unhurried. I explained I had an SRRV application in process, gave her the reference numbers Aldrin had provided at the start, asked her to check the status. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. I sat at the table in my apartment with the ceiling fan turning and a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, listening to hold music that was cheerful in a way that felt inappropriate. She came back. She had no record of an application under my name, no record of the reference numbers. She asked if I could confirm the accreditation number of the consultant I'd engaged. I gave her Aldrin's. Another pause. That number, she said carefully, did not correspond to any registered consultant in their system. I thanked her. I put the phone down. I sat there for a while. 310,000 pesos. 5,012 euros at the exchange rate the day I'd transferred it. Gone. Not misplaced, not delayed, not entangled in bureaucracy. Gone to a man who had built a convincing enough facade to stand up for 4 months and then simply stepped out of it and walked away. I filed a complaint with the NBI, the National Bureau of Investigation, the following day. A friend from the expat Facebook group, a Canadian lad who'd lived in Cebu for 9 years and knew how things actually worked, came with me to help navigate the process. The complaint was accepted. I was given a case reference number. The NBI officer was professional and not unkind. He told me, without saying it directly, that the likelihood of recovering the money was low. I understood. Aldrin's website stayed up for another 3 weeks. Then it disappeared. The Facebook page stayed up. I reported it. It stayed up. That's the Aldrin part of the story, and it's the cleanest part, in a way, because it has a clear villain and a clear loss. 5,000 euros, Bad, painful, but discreet, countable, over. The other part was harder. One asked Marovich to come to the apartment on the Saturday. I'd been thinking about how to do this for several days. Not the Aldrin part. 1/500 told her about that on the phone, and she'd been quietly furious on my behalf. The kind of controlled anger that's more convincing than shouting. What I hadn't told her about was the spreadsheet, the forward projection, the numbers that were the actual problem. She arrived mid-morning. She'd brought bibinka from a bakery near her place, the rice cake wrapped in banana leaf, still warm. She put it on the counter and sat down at the table and looked at me in the way that meant she knew something was coming and was prepared to hear it. I opened the laptop and turned it toward her. I didn't explain it at length. She was an educated woman who managed travel bookings and client accounts for a living. She could read a table of figures. I let her read it. The total I'd transferred to her family across 22 months, P452,000. About 7,200 euros. The Aldrin money, 310,000, another 5,000. Living costs above what the pension covered. The apartment, the visa runs, the accumulated small expenses of being somewhere other than home. Savings remaining, approximately 54,000 euros. Projection at current rate. Exhausted before I turned 68. Then the pension only, with no SRRV, no health care rights, no legal status. On a tourist visa, I'd have to keep renewing by leaving the country every 2 months. She read it for a long time. Long enough that I had time to get up, pour water, sit back down. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Not crying, just wet, the way eyes get before someone decides not to cry. She didn't say she hadn't known. She didn't say the family requests were not what they appeared to be. She said, "And I want to get this right, because the precise words matter." She said she was sorry, that she'd tried to manage it, that she knew it had become too much, that she'd told her mother, after Lynn's hospital bill, that it had to stop, and her mother had agreed, and then Carlo had called with the second semester fees, and she hadn't known how to say no to Carlo, because Carlo was this close to qualifying, and a qualified nurse in this family was. She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I think about that moment a lot. The way she didn't make excuses exactly, but also couldn't fully explain why the thing that happened had happened, because there wasn't a simple explanation. There was just a system, a family, a set of expectations that predated me by 40 years and didn't have an off switch. I asked her if she'd expected me to stay. Forever, I meant. In Cebu. With this arrangement continuing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd hoped I would stay. That was different from expecting it, she said. She'd hoped it, but she hadn't let herself rely on it. That answer did something to me that I still haven't fully sorted out. It made me, I don't know. Sad, I suppose, is the simple word. Not for myself, for the whole situation, for the gap between what two people hoped and what the numbers would allow. We didn't break up that morning. It wasn't a scene. We ate the bibinka, which was good, genuinely good, warm and slightly sweet with coconut cream. And we talked for 2 hours about practical things, about what I needed to do, about what she understood, about the fact that I needed to go home, recalibrate, that I wasn't in a position to continue as things were. She said she understood. The thing is, I believe she did. I also believe that understanding it and having been able to stop it were, for her, 2 different things. And I've thought about that distinction for a long time since, and I still don't know how to resolve it into a simple verdict about who was responsible for what. The truth is probably that Marovich was both real and insufficient. The Philippines was both livable and incomplete. The dream was both possible and incorrectly costed. None of those things cancel each other out. They just sit there, all true at once, which is untidy but accurate. That evening, I opened a new browser tab and looked at flights to Dublin. I spent 3 weeks winding things down. It's a strange process, dismantling a life you'd assembled carefully. The apartment lease had 2 months left. I paid out the remainder, about 44,000 pesos, 670 euro, and the landlord, a quiet man named Mang Renato, who'd never bothered me once, shook my hand and said he was sorry I was going. He meant it, I think. Some people just mean what they say. I donated most of what I'd accumulated. The kitchen things, the extra bedding, a small electric fan I'd bought because the ceiling fan wasn't always enough. Marovich helped me sort it. She was practical about it in the way she was practical about everything, which was both useful and, if I'm honest, slightly hard to watch. I went to Bohol one last time, took the fast ferry, same as the first time, same discomfort. Marovich came with me. We spent 2 days with Lola Coring and Precious, who was 18 now and had her secondary school results and was going to study nursing. The irony of that did not escape me, and I did not comment on it. I brought pasalubong, dried mangoes, some biscuits from a bakery near SM Cebu, a notebook for Precious, because Marovich had mentioned she liked to write. You always bring something. Marovich taught me that in the first week, and it had become automatic. Lola Coring made me eat an enormous amount of food. We drank instant coffee on the narrow porch and watched a small child across the lane attempt to teach a dog to sit, with no apparent success, for about 40 minutes. Lola Coring said something in Cebuano. Marovich translated, "She said I was a good man, but I worried too much about money." This was both the most accurate and most inaccurate thing anyone has ever said about me, and I couldn't work out how to explain that distinction across 3 languages, so I just nodded. When we left, Lola Coring held my hand for a moment in both of hers. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. I landed in Dublin on an October morning, 9 days before my 64th birthday. Awefa picked me up. She looked at me for a moment in the arrivals hall, that assessment she does, where she's checking something she won't name. And then she said, I looked thin, but otherwise fine. I said I was fine. She said right, and drove me home. The house in Bishopstown had been looked after properly by the tenant, a young couple who'd kept the place clean, and had even fixed a dripping tap I'd been meaning to sort for 2 years. I moved back in, put the Waterford crystal clock on the mantelpiece, made tea. Now, I said I'd give you the actual numbers at the end, and I will, because that's the only part of this story that's genuinely useful to anyone watching. I arrived in the Philippines with 92,000 euros in savings. I returned to Cork with 54,000. 38,000 euros spent across 2 years and 8 months. Let me tell you where it went, because the categories matter. Family transfers to Marovich's family across 22 separate transactions, approximately 7,200 euros. Every one of them was a real need. I want to keep saying that. The roof was real. The hospital was real. Carlo's nursing degree was real, and Carlo has since qualified and is working in Riyadh and sends money home every month, which is exactly what was supposed to happen and is of no financial benefit to me whatsoever. Aldrin's fraudulent SRRV fees, 5,000 euros. The rest, living costs above what the pension covered, visa runs, flights, the accumulated ordinary expense of being somewhere, accounts for the remainder. The pension continues. The house rental income continues. I am not in difficulty. But here is the thing that doesn't fit in the spreadsheet. I was 63 when I went. I will be, let's say, optimistic, 90 when I die. That's 27 years of retirement to fund. 54,000 euros. At anything like the rate I was spending it in Cebu, even without the family transfers, is 6 or 7 years, not 27. The gap between those two numbers is the actual problem, and it's the problem that nobody in the retirement content I watched ever addressed directly. They showed me the monthly costs. They did not show me what happens to those costs when you're the only person in any room who has savings. They did not model the family obligation spiral, which is not a scam. I want to be very clear about that. It is a genuine cultural system that operates on entirely rational logic if you are Filipino, and on entirely ruinous logic if you are a retired Irish bookkeeper with a finite pot of savings and no income beyond a pension. They did not tell me that the cheap cost of living comes with a social cost attached, which is that your relative wealth, modest by any Western standard, marks you as a resource in a context of real poverty, and that the people who draw on that resource are not villains. They are families. They are mothers with diabetes, and brothers studying nursing, and sisters having complicated births in private hospitals, because the government hospital wait is dangerous. They are real, and you, if you go, will be real too. Real and finite, with a spreadsheet that only tells half the story. I have a few specific things to say to anyone watching this who is planning to retire to the Philippines, and I'll say them plainly because that's the only way I know how to be. Verify every visa consultant directly with the Philippine Retirement Authority before you pay them a single peso. The PRA website is pra.gov.h. Call the number. Email the address. Ask them to confirm the consultant's accreditation number. Aldrin's website looked legitimate. It had their logo on it. He was not on their list. That check would have taken me 20 minutes and saved me 5,000 euros. Do it. Build a family obligations budget before you go. Not as a maybe. As a line in the spreadsheet. If you are in a relationship with a Filipino or Filipina whose family has limited income, and most families will, you will be asked to help. The amounts will each seem reasonable. They will add up. Know in advance what your ceiling is and say it plainly early, before the precedent is set. This is the conversation I never had and should have. Model your savings over 20 years, not 2. The monthly cost of living comparison videos are not lying to you. They're just showing you a very short section of a very long film. And understand, really understand, what it means to be the wealthiest person in any room you regularly enter. It changes how people relate to you in ways that are not malicious and not simple, and not something you can opt out of by being careful. It is just the reality of the economic gap, and it will cost you, and you should know that going in. Maravik and I still send each other a WhatsApp message occasionally. Not often. She sent me a photo in February. Precious, in her nursing college uniform on the first day of term. Standing very straight. Serious face. She looks exactly like her mother. I sent back a thumbs up, which is inadequate, but I didn't know what else to say that would fit in a message. The Waterford crystal clock keeps good time. It's a fine piece, actually. I was wrong to leave it in the box. That's Brendan's story. And here, back at Inside the Philippines, is where we want to sit with it for a moment before we go. Because this one is different, as we said at the start. There's no single villain to point at. Maravik was real. The family needs were real. The retirement arithmetic was accurate as far as it went. What failed Brendan wasn't dishonesty on anyone's part. It was incompleteness. A picture of monthly costs with no column for cultural context, No row for obligation dynamics, no projection beyond the first comfortable year. There are thousands of Brendans in the Philippines right now. Men who did the research, ran the numbers, made sensible decisions, and are watching their savings move in a direction the retirement videos never showed them. Some of them will be fine. Some won't. The difference, often, comes down to whether they understood the full accounting before they arrived. If you are planning a Philippines retirement, take Brendan's specific advice seriously. Verify your SRRV consultant with the PRA directly. Build family obligations into your budget as a real line item, and model your money over decades, not months. And if you've got your own story, if you went, if you're there now, if you got it right, or got it wrong, or landed somewhere in the complicated middle, the comments are open. This channel exists because of those stories. Thanks for watching Inside the Philippines. We'll see you in the next one.